Noam Chomsky is so many things, and you know many of them in your program. One could call him the father of modern linguistics, establishing essentially a whole field, which is itself a rare thing to do. He's written over 100 books. He was named in at least several surveys as the top public intellectual in the world, and certainly in 2005 and twice since then. In at least one survey, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. This is all said without hyperbole. That is substantiated because one of the things I learned from Noam is to always try and substantiate claims. He has been cited more than any other living scholar in the humanities and arts between 1980 and 1992. He, besides being an incredible intellectual, he came to the public domain during the Vietnam War, during which he bravely was one of the first people to openly protest and led much of the protests against the Vietnam War, during which he became an American. During which he certainly became an American hero. It established a tradition for him of being marginalized in U.S. media. We were just noticing, some of you may have seen the New York Times online, that there was an interview with him on racism. It's in online. You won't find it in the hard copy, because the last time Noam was interviewed or quoted in the New York Times was in the 1970s, which says something which we'll get to in this discussion. This is also a very personal moment for me, and it would be disingenuous not to mention it because I'm sure it'll creep in. I'm not a big believer in hero worship because you usually are disappointed. But I do have a few intellectual heroes too, to be exact, and people that I always thought I would want to emulate if I ever got to be in a position even remotely like theirs. Those two people are Richard Feynman, who I wrote a book about, and Noam Chomsky. I had the opportunity to know both of them, but I got to know Noam when I was a graduate student at MIT. MIT has the wisdom to not require you to take any courses if you're a graduate student, which was wonderful. So I didn't take any physics classes, but I took 2 courses in U.S. foreign policy from Noam Chomsky, and it was a revelation to me. The first thing that personally impressed me about him was a man who took time out from a field that he clearly loved, linguistics, to talk about issues that matter to people. The courses that he taught for me at MIT were courses that weren't on the curriculum. He just voluntarily taught these courses in addition to his regular curriculum because he thought they were important. As a graduate student, not in linguistics, but in physics, I would walk into his office periodically and sit down and ask him a question. And we would talk for an hour, and I was just overwhelmed that he took me seriously. He showed me a kind of respect which I did not expect. And the last thing was that when I went, and Noam spends a lot of his time, and has always spent a lot of his time, out in public. And in Cambridge, there are many times when I was fortunate enough to go listen to him. And what impressed me was not just his discussions, but afterwards, he answered questions well past midnight to the last person that asked the question. He showed a kind of respect and generosity for people's interests that is not common in most public intellectuals. And I always hoped that I would try and emulate those things, and every time I'm in that situation, I think of Noam. And some people say, what would Jesus do? But I ask, what would Noam do? So it is therefore one of the... It is therefore one of the truly greatest honors of my life to welcome onto the stage Noam Chomsky.
Would you, or do you consider yourself a person of faith?
I try not to have faith. I believe in a principle that was enunciated rather well by Bertrand Russell, which is that you should try to keep away from having irrational beliefs. You should believe some things that for which you can find some evidence or some support, apart from commitment to principles like equality and freedom and justice and so on. Those, I wouldn't say that's faith. Those are things you're committed to. But as far as beliefs about the world, reality, my feeling is one should try to, as much as possible, have substantiated beliefs, or at least beliefs for which evidence could be appropriate.
Well, then, would you consider yourself, paradoxically, a person who has faith in the scientific method?
I think it's the only method we have to try to get some approximate understanding of the world. I don't have faith that it'll reach the truth, or even that it's leading us in the true direction. In fact, as someone committed to the scientific method, I'm also committed to its consequences, and among them are that you and I and the rest of the species are organic creatures who have our specific capacities and limitations, and we simply don't know and have no reason to believe that these capacities are such that we can gain the truth about the world. We do our best, but that's the most we can do.
Part of the legacy of Ronald Reagan, during the Reagan years, Pakistan was ruled by the most awful of its many horrible dictators, Zia-ul-Haq, and he had two major policies. One was to carry out radical Islamization of the country with the funding of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the center of radical Islam, and also the center of funding of jihadism, and also the leading ally of the United States and Britain. Traditionally, the U.S. and Britain have been supporting radical Islam throughout the region. There are good reasons for that, and they continue to. The reasons are you can tell it from the internal documents, British and American internal documents. The reason is kind of a rational analysis. The real threat, they say, is the virus of secular nationalism. That's dangerous. Secular nationalism, say Nasser, for example, can lead to the possibility of efforts to try to take the resources of the region and use them for their own populations, rather than for the benefit of the West and the ruling, super-rich ruling families. So that's a real problem. And the only barrier to secular nationalism, to the virus of secular nationalism, as it's called, is radical Islamism. So the U.S. and Britain as well have been strongly supporting radical Islam for a long time and continue to. It's a little ironic when you hear them complaining about the Muslim Brotherhood, which by comparison is moderate Islam. And that remains true. Saudi Arabia, for example, is given free rein to crush demonstrations. No talk of no-fly zones. There was a day of rage called in Riyadh, but the police presence was so extensive that nobody could even show up. They're too intimidated. Same in Kuwait. These are rich oil states which have loyal dictators. So therefore, they're free to do anything they like. Bahrain is pretty much the same story. They're worried about the spillover to Saudi Arabia, and that's, you know, what happened there. Well, in this case, the Saudi Arabian funding of radical Islamism, which actually began in the early 60s, kind of a missionary effort to spread radical Islamic Wahhabi-type Islamism all throughout the Islamic world, massive funding, madrasas, and so on. That penetrated Pakistan in the 1980s, and a lot of these reformist lawyers came out of those madrasas. They've had a big effect on Pakistan. And at the same time, Zia-ul-Haq was developing nuclear weapons. The Reagan administration pretended, and the British pretended that they didn't know it. Of course they did, so that they could continue to fund their favor a dictator in Pakistan.
But there people would say that you cannot have moral principles unless you adhere to a faith.
If I attribute those principles to a divine creature who I define as ordering me to have those principles, the principles don't become any more better established. So that's a useless step. It's true that our moral principles are not firmly grounded in unshakable evidence and argument, but nothing is going to make them any more firmly grounded. As for having a meaningful life, that seems to me irrelevant. No people who have meaningful lives with faith and without faith. Perfect example of extreme irrationality is what we've just been talking about, what Orwell called doublethink. The ability to have two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time and to believe both of them. That's the peak of irrationality. And that virtually defines the elite intellectual community.
Successful intellectual, right?
Yeah, okay, so that's irrationality. Now let's take concrete examples of fundamentalist irrationality. So I'll give you a real example. Actually, it's an example I knew about 5 years ago, but I didn't publish it because it sounded so crazy. It couldn't be true. It turns out to be true. It's now verified. In January 2003, immediately before the invasion of Iraq, George Bush was trying to round up international support for the invasion. And he met the French President Chirac. And in this meeting with Chirac, he started ranting about a passage from Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel. It's a very obscure passage nobody understands. It's a passage about Gog and Magog. Nobody knows if they're people or places or whatever they are. But Gog and Magog are supposed to come from the north and attack Israel. And then we get off into ultra-fanatic Christian evangelical madness. There's a whole big story about how Gog and Magog come down, attack Israel. There's a battle in Armageddon. Everybody gets slaughtered. And the souls who are saved rise to heaven. Okay, some kind of story like that. Reagan apparently believed it. When his handlers didn't control him enough and he was kind of off by himself, he'd start raving about this stuff. And for him, Gog and Magog were Russia. For Bush, Gog and Magog were Iraq. So he told this to Chirac, and Chirac had no clue what he was talking about. So he approached the French Foreign Office, the Élysée, and said, do you know what this madman is raving about? And they didn't know either. So they approached a Belgian, pretty well-known Belgian theologian who wrote a sort of a disquisition on this passage and the way it's interpreted and what it might mean and so on. Okay, how do I know? Well, I know because that Belgian theologian and his friends sent me a copy of it with the background of the story. I never published it because this just sounded too off the wall. Finally, I was talking to an Australian academic researcher, and I mentioned it to him. He decided to look into it. It turns out to be correct. In fact, the story appears in the biographies of Chirac and in other evidence. So yeah, that actually happened. So here's the world in the hands of a raving lunatic who, is talking about Gog and Magog and Armageddon and the souls rising to heaven, and the world survived. Well, okay, that's not a small thing in the United States. I don't know the percentages, but it's maybe 25-30% of the population. That's pretty serious irrationality.
What in general do you feel then about religion's role in human society, both historically and here in the 21st century?
Overall, I think it's, in terms of its effect on policy, ranging from social policy to war, I think it's been mostly negative. In fact, often extremely negative. With regard to individuals, it varies. For a lot of people, it just means a lot, and always has.
What do you attribute to that? Do you think there's something biological, like many people have argued that we're sort of hardwired for religion? Do you think that religion is sort of keeping in lockstep with evolutionary processes?
Well, first of all, we know very little about the evolution of humans in any relevant respect. I mean, we know a lot about, the fossil record and so on. But when you get to human cognitive capacities or and so, higher, what we call sometimes higher mental faculties, the evolutionary record is just extremely thin. We're a very recent product of evolution. Modern humans, from a cognitive perspective, cognitive behavioral perspective, only emerged within roughly the last 100,000 years, which is like a flick of an eye in evolutionary time. And we're all more or less identical. There's very little genetic variation relevant genetic variation among humans, because there's been, we probably come from a small breeding group somewhere in East Africa, probably no later than, say, 50,000 years ago. There's no time for anything to have happened. In a sense, it's like almost, in my view, virtually a tautology to say that a commitment to religious belief is the result of evolution, because we're the result of evolution. Just like my chin is, my toenails are. So are my higher mental faculties. But that just doesn't tell you very much. I mean, we all know, without doing pop science, that people do want to find ways to give an intelligible picture of the universe around them, to find comfort, to find association with others. And they do it in all kinds of ways. Some of them we call religion. A lot of some of it we call magic. In the modern period of the rise of organized modern science, of course, goes way back, but really as a major phenomenon in human life. There's been a concerted attempt to gain an understanding of the world by means that do permit confirmation, disconfirmation, building on the results of others, and so on. So we call science. Okay, we should push that as far as we can. Surely we want to understand as much as we can about the world, and that's the best way to understand it.
I want to end with the thoughts of the future, and also a subject that I can't help bring up given your writing. George Bush reportedly proclaimed that God told me to strike at Al-Qaeda, and I struck them. And then he instructed me to strike at Saddam, which I did. And then you wrote, and now I am determined to solve the problem of the Middle East, he said. And then your words, also at the command of the Lord of hosts, the war god, whom we are instructed by the Holy Book to worship above all other gods. And as I mentioned, the elite press dutifully refers to his messianic mission to solve the problem of the Middle East, in fact, the world, following, quote, our responsibility to history to rid the world of evil. The early English colonists in North America were following the word of the Lord as they slaughtered the Amalekites, in the New Israel that they were liberating from the native blight. Those who followed them, also Bible-waving, God-fearing Christians, did their religious duty by conquering and possessing the Promised Land, ridding it of millions of Canaanites, and proceeding to war against the Papists in Florida, Mexico, and California. Now,
it's sustainable again, I'm afraid.
Yes, but the question I'm going to ask you may not be the one you think. So, you once told me in an email when I talked about my concerns about religion, that you rightly, then this is a profoundly important thing. You don't care what people believe; it's what they do that counts. But beliefs influence actions, and it seems to me, and I'd like to hear your comment, that if you really talk about, if we go back to your argument for the responsibility of intellectuals, which is to expose lies, is it not, therefore, our responsibility to expose religious lies?
Sure. If, say, a third of the American population believes that the world was created a couple of thousand years ago, exactly as it is today, yes, it is our responsibility to expose that lie and to tell the truth. On the other hand, if, say I'm thinking of a particular person, but could give many examples, if a Peruvian peasant who immigrated to the United States 30 years ago and has managed to create a decent life for herself under pretty awful conditions, is an evangelical Christian who has a prayer group
every evening that goes to visit the sick and pray with them, I'm not going to read her a lesson in epistemology.
Okay. Well.